but can I somewhat begin, seeing I've already begun, by acknowledging you, Graham, and your work, and Mark as well. It's always good to actually follow after you, Mark. You speak strongly, passionately, and I would say quite correctly about the situation as it is. And to you all as members, what Mark, Graham, and others within the organisation do is pretty fantastic. They are very, very strong advocates for you. I recall chatting to you both before you went in to see the Minister. You expressed at that time the great disappointment of what was not happening around that guidance, and I also know the disappointment, if I could put it that way, that happened afterwards. It's still a battle that has to be fought. Soon after the last, was Christchurch, wasn't it, last year? You came along with some others to our Health Select Committee to give us a briefing. It was a hope to try and stir things back up again. In some ways, I think that's failed, not because of what you shared or the importance of what you emphasised, nor I think, well, I hope not, the work of the committee itself, but trying to energise in this sector is problematic. So I thought I might just spend a few moments perhaps with suggestions, though they're probably nothing new. I will definitely echo what Mark was saying. Hammer your MPs. Not literally, but hammer your MP, your local MP, hammer the candidates. It makes a huge difference. A lot of issues in health can just sort of stay to the side. Someone like myself who works in the field tries to take an interest. But a lot of my colleagues, it just won't be there. They're busy thinking about other things. And yep, groups like the Foundation can come in and speak, and that's really important. But there's nothing quite like a local constituent coming into your office and sharing their story and putting you as the MP on the spot and saying, what will you do as my local Member of Parliament to support me with my calls for greater access and support in this case in prostate cancer. So absolutely get in front of your MPs, not only in this, I think 2 months to go in the election, but afterwards as well. And the more senior the person, the better. So if you happen to be a constituent in the minister's electorate or an associate minister's or in those of the leadership in the opposition, absolutely go for it. Look, I don't expect the AQIP stuff to be finished in a year either. It does seem to be moving incredibly slowly. And when I addressed the conference last year, I posed the question, which I still haven't answered myself, is why certain cancers are treated quite differently from others. And you rightly pull out the breast cancer as an example. In fact, the select committees just put forward recommendations to expand or extend screening from 69 years of age up to 74. And that came out of a petition process. So that's where groups like yourself, in this case, Breast Screening Aotearoa and 10,000 others, petitioned us to look at the question. So it's a little bit like the briefing you did, but it actually is a much more formal process, so maybe something else that can be thought of. Hopefully, for that particular area of cancer treatment and prevention that proceeds. We've had a little bit of around the melanoma space, where actually the government responded effectively to a public outcry to fund pembrolizumab, or you'd probably know of it as Keytruda. But the corollary and the flip side is in the, say, the lung cancer space. They are crying out for that same drug, but we're not yet funding that. Granted, that's a Pharmac decision, but we're not yet funding that. In other areas of cancer, we are not yet responding. So I share that probably for two reasons. First and foremost, some cancers are receiving the focus that we'd like, but others, including within your own area, are not. And how exactly, even as a politician, and I suppose it's providing reasons rather than justifications, is why are we not responding as quickly in this space as others? And I think so much of it maybe comes down to basically, again, hammering us as politicians, making this incredibly personal. Get in our face as individuals, as groups, as government, and keep pushing. Because fundamentally, this is, and you know it yourselves, this is the most diagnosed cancer in the country, but it's not the one that we speak about the most. What the Select Committee did a few years ago, I think, was a really positive step. But it does seem to have moved incredibly slowly since then. And I raised it last year as well. It's all well and good to go out to the GPs, but they get quite overwhelmed. And apologies to any GPs here who I may be maligning unintentionally, but we have to keep that pressure up. We've got it also in the hepatitis C space, so we've funded new drugs there, and there's a whole lot of guidance which goes around their use. Some GPs are picking it up, some are not. It shows there's a systematic failure, if you will, in that space, which has to be addressed. And part of that does definitely come down to politicians. It certainly comes down to the ministry, perhaps engagement too with the likes of the Royal College, the New Zealand Medical Association and others. And probably finally, how do we actually engage with Kiwis to talk about this particular area? I joked last year that I was before you of having turned 40 and having to think about prostate cancer and how awkward that is. That awkwardness has always stayed with me, and I've always been sort of conscious of it, even as someone who works within the medical field, granted as a politician, that there is this funny awkwardness in this space that, particularly as men, we're always uncomfortable talking about. I'd share that my dad went last year to get his PSA test and then a biopsy for prostate cancer. Fortunately, in his case, all clear, but incredibly difficult in this case for my dad to talk to me about it. Kudos to his GP, who was actually very happy to do the PSA test, but there is this awkwardness that we have to break through. And it's, I suppose, an encouragement rather than a challenge to those of you in the foundation. Speak about this, as you probably do already, openly and freely to people, to break down those stigmas. And ultimately, we can have a much more mature conversation. So the government needs to be continually challenged in this space. As I said at the start, I think your leadership within the foundation are advocating incredibly strongly, and I look forward to continuing that conversation later. Just to finish talking in health in general, partly to try and set the scene, because as an election year, you're always going to have politicians coming to promise the world, and particularly in health. I'm not always sure that's completely realistic, and perhaps that's what you'd expect from a government MP. But two thoughts. In general, the government's spending something like $16.8 billion of your dollars now in health, the largest spend ever. There are some who will say that there's been cuts, that we're underfunding. Well, the former is not true. Projections that go out there that we're 1.7 or 2.5 billion in cuts is quite wrong. That's based on what positions of other parties feel we should be spending. But is there underfunding? The simple answer is yes. There's always underfunding in health. Health is one of those dynamics, and I used to work within the private health sector, granted in insurance rather than medical. There's always the need for more money in health. If I could somewhat flippantly say, we could double the health budget tomorrow and we would still have problems. The question becomes, whenever there's that call for more money, where does it come from? And I suppose it's just putting out that there is a challenge to all of us, particularly in the political realm, of where to balance how much money we're taking off you and where we prioritise it. And I often say to my constituents, and they come in and say they want a new classroom, I say, that's fantastic. Where's that money coming from the health sector? When someone comes in and says to me they want to have more drugs funded for X, Y, and Z, it's like, that's great. What classrooms are we not going to build? So I suppose it's just trying very quickly to illustrate what is the balance within the political world of what we are attempting to do, and to, I'd suggest, approach with some caution. Any who just come and say, yeah, we'll fix this tomorrow, we'll just give you more money, that'll solve it. That's always a difficult call, and I'd also add, even with the more funding that the government's put in, we're still not succeeding in this space, because I think primarily this isn't actually a money issue first and foremost. It's about actually the approach, and it begins with acknowledging this is a real problem, a problem not just for men, but as you illustrated, Mark, for the whole family. Again, I said it last year, and I'm sorry that I'm repeating it, but 3,000 men are diagnosed, but that's 3,000 men who will have wives and partners, children, grandchildren. This is something which goes much, much wider. And so if there's a final encouragement, before I suspect I take more challenges than questions, you have a huge number of voices that can be heard. And I'd encourage each of you, alongside Graham, Mark, and the wider community, make those voices heard individually. Make your personal stories heard. It's probably very difficult at times, but do make it heard that you have had trouble getting to these tests, that there is still, for some reason, scepticism within elements of the medical fraternity to its efficacy, and to make it really clear as well, this is not simply access to the treatment, but the post-treatment element as well. I know when Mark put it up earlier, everything from the sexual dysfunction to the psychological side to incontinence, all of these things need to be addressed. It's not simply good enough to have gone in for the treatment and the doctors to say that's done now, or the government to say, no, we've done what we've got to do. Share those stories, hammer the message home. And finally, and I'm sorry I'm not going to be here, but Professor McLeod today around palliative care, I don't know if the professor's here, look, an incredibly important space, not just for prostate cancer, in an area that I'm quite passionate about. Been looking at the assisted dying euthanasia position for 2 years, and as you might expect, palliative care has played a big role on that. Some really good elements have been developing and funding from government, but still a long way to go in that space as well, particularly in understanding what good palliative care can do these days.